On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Cisco Bradley, professor of history and director of the Music and Migration Lab at the Pratt Institute. He is currently the Digital Studies Fellow at the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. Dr. Bradley is an award-winning author, film director, and screenwriter. His work spans the disciplines and fields of Black studies, music studies, migration studies, oral history, and cultural memory. He is the author of 4 books, including Universal Tonality, The Life and Music of William Parker, The Williamsburg Avant-Garde, Experimental Music and Sound on the Brooklyn Waterfront, and I Hear Freedom, The Great Migration, Free Jazz, and Black Power. His first documentary film, Take Me to Fendika, illustrating the work of world-renowned Ethiopian dancer Malaku Bale, won numerous awards, including Best Documentary at Cannes Fifi in 2025. His current research focuses on tracing the oral transmission of African music in North America and the Caribbean from the 17th to early 20th centuries. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Cisco Bradley, professor of history and director of the Music and Migration Lab at the Pratt Institute. How are you doing today, Dr. Bradley?
Doing great. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to talk to you about the work you do around Black music and migration, and especially with your latest book, I Hear Freedom, The Great Migration, Free Jazz, and Black Power. That's out now. So let's dive in. So how did you get into Black studies, and what keeps you committed to doing that work?
Yeah, I came to Black studies through music studies and migration studies, both of which have been pretty central to what I've been doing the last 15 years or so. And, I think any study really of American music should have some connection to Black studies, I think, naturally. And in my case, I've been working primarily, I've worked in various areas, but I've been really looking at jazz, at avant-garde music, experimental music, a range of things. And I've always felt that to understand those forms of music, I think we have to look to Black studies as a frame and as a guide. I think for understanding that. So that's been a big part of it for me. Also, with migration studies. I think in some ways, I think we're still getting our bearings for understanding, the impact of the Great Migration. There's obviously been a lot that's been written about it, but I can't think of a more kind of culturally impactful event in American history in terms of, and just the mass movement of people and then kind of the reconstitution of communities all across the country. And so, the Great Migration for me has been a big point of my, especially my last 5 years or so of the work that I've been doing. And, and that of course leads me also to Black studies.
So, the book does really look at the impact of the Great Migration on free jazz, and in particular in the Ohio Valley. So what do you want to say a little bit about the book in general, but then also what led you to focus on that particular route of migration, and specifically Cleveland and Detroit, because those are the places that you focus on in the book?
Yeah, well, so what I did, sort of the background research that I did for the book, it began. The whole book began with me thinking about the saxophonist Albert Ayler, who was born in Cleveland in 1936, and emerged into primarily on the scene in New York, and then he worked in Europe as well in the 60s, and so something about Albert Ayler's sound from the beginning of me thinking about his music made me feel like I couldn't completely understand him as a musician, just thinking he was born in Cleveland in 1936. And it got me thinking about how I think a lot of musicians of that generation, in a way, I think for us to understand their biographies, I think we need to delve deeper into the history of the country and understanding the Great Migration really to inform that. So, a lot of critics in the 60s, that were writing about Albert Adler, people like Amiri Baraka, um, you know, they they talked about how they were hearing, a wide range of things. You could hear early New Orleans music, maybe in his sound to an extent, marching bands. You could hear, Baraka talked about hearing field shouts um, in Albert Adler's sound. And so I got to thinking, how can we understand that, and what kinds of cultural inheritance were being passed down over time. And some of that is, of course, embedded in the music, right? Embedded in the blues, embedded in other forms of music. But I got interested in thinking about ancestors and lineages, and so I researched the entire free jazz generation that Albert Adler was a part of, looking at ancestral origins. So it's about 200 people. It ranges everybody from Ornette Coleman to Cecil Taylor, that whole generation, John Coltrane, of course. And then what I what I began to see is there were sort of several distinct patterns of migration from various places in the South into the urban North, and um, you know we have the sort of movement up the East Coast to places like New York and New England, movement from say the Piedmont in the Carolinas up to Philadelphia. Um, the migrations out of the Mississippi Delta to Chicago, and then westwards, sometimes to Oklahoma and LA. And of course, migrations out of Texas, mostly going westwards, but some of them coming north. And so I began to break those down, and what I noticed is, of course, people were going along routes that were available to them, right? That were possible, train routes often dictating, what was possible for people who were migrating. And so, I began to look at the Ohio Valley as a distinct region, as defined by um, migratory origins. And Cleveland and Detroit. I mean, the compositions of those cities are a little bit different, I suppose, within the Black community, but very strong roots in Alabama, in particular, Eastern Mississippi, not so much from the Delta. Um, from all the way over to sort of central Georgia, and then of course also from the kind of the upper South, a lot of roots in Kentucky as well, and some in North Carolina, some in Virginia, but um, yeah. So I began to, I guess, think about you know how can we root the history of even say a mid 20th century musical movement in this sort of longer kind of span of history, and using migration in a way as the link. So that's where the book began, and the first three chapters really take place in the South mostly, and looking at ancestral origins, migratory movements that people made, ranging from the Underground Railroad, which uh, which I cover in the first chapter. And it was interesting to see how many musicians in Ohio, I mean, in Ohio in particular, that had roots in the Underground Railroad. Um, and then, chapters 2 and 3, looking at, different phases of the migration from the South. And then from chapter 4 onwards, I really start to delve into, looking at a series of musicians that emerged in Detroit and Cleveland.
So you're coming at this understanding, or this study of how migrations have influenced the development of free jazz and Black Power. But so you have music studies, you have migration studies, framing, utilizing Black studies. In you're trained in history, so how do you situate yourself in relationship to the multiple disciplines that your work is crossing?
Yeah, well, as you said, I'm trained as a historian, not as a musicologist. So sometimes people think I'm a musicologist. but I think, reading the work, they would, I think see that I'm a historian. So, I think, yeah, I think, I've become more interdisciplinary as I have developed as a scholar. Yeah, one of the first things I did, when I moved to New York to take the job at the Pratt Institute is I began interviewing a lot of musicians, and I had never been trained in graduate school. I hadn't been formally trained in oral history. I'd studied the aspects of it, but never in the sort of the collection process.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, for me, it was a way of, beginning to, to get to know people and to learn about the history of this community through the voices of the people that, the practitioners. And, when I started it, I didn't really think about necessarily where I was going with it. I think it was more exploratory in a lot of ways. Yeah, and I was interviewing younger musicians, and then sort of over time began to think, oh, no, I should be interviewing the elders, and so I began interviewing older musicians, and um, learning a lot just about about the music and about their artistic processes and all of that. But for what that I mean, that so that really brought in a different kind of component. I mean, I still root much of what I do in archives, in I guess, more formal archives, but oral history has become a major component of that, and, I think some, I guess, anthropological and sort of ethnographic components to some of that, and a lot of that I just had to, I think, kind of learn, through the process, and sometimes learn by making mistakes or thinking about an interview after I'd done it and thinking, "Okay, how will I do the next one?" And
Mhm.
so, I think I've collected something like 500 oral histories over the past 13 years, and it's so that that's been really inspiring, and I've certainly, collected ones that I didn't necessarily have a plan to include necessarily in a study, but just to document and to learn. Um, so oral history is, I think, one way that I feel like I've kind of crossed over disciplines a bit, and also I think engaged with Black studies in a different kind of way, where I've been interviewing a lot of people and getting to know their work, their art, their music through their own perspectives, and that has been really valuable. And I can't really imagine writing a history of music without those voices in it now. And so that's become a big part of it. I think um, you know I think I don't know, I teach in an interdisciplinary department as well, and so I think I've also had a lot of exposure to people in other disciplines, probably more so than if I had taught in a history department. And so, I think that's that comes through the work a lot. And, yeah, and then, I think engaging with Black cultural theory in certain ways has also been, pretty central to, I think, how I've been thinking about, the artistic process and cultural development and so forth. So, I mean, especially people like Fred Moten, who I've worked with directly actually a little bit, and then found a lot of his ideas kind of pretty foundational to the way that I think about not only Black music but Black experimentality, and so yeah, I think there's been quite a lot of exploration, I think, post, graduating with my PhD, which has been exciting. I didn't know that it would necessarily be that way, as I began my career.
Thank you. So I wanna ask about a couple things, but
Sure.
one, so you talked about the importance of oral history in doing that, and the process of it sometimes being even more important than whether or not that particular oral history is gonna be included in something. So with I know with the latest book, right, there's only so much oral histories you can do given the time frame that you're looking at, and especially with the project that you mentioned prior to us recording, right? If you're tracing the transmission of Black music from the 17th to the 20th centuries, there's only so much oral history you can do to speak to
Right.
that. Um,
Right. Well, sorry, I didn't mean to cut your
no, 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 you're
please.
fine. You're probably going to go where I was gonna go with it, which is in what ways does that serve as a starting point for other things, or how do you fill in some of those vast gaps, when that's not available?
Well, I should say, the oral histories are what inspired me to think a lot more about ancestors, and
Okay.
it's purely rooted in. I mean, I should say, out of the 500 oral histories, I've interviewed a lot of people, and I've never actually looked at the numbers exactly, but I think it's probably about 50% white musicians, 50% black musicians, something like that, probably in that neighborhood. Maybe 60% black musicians, and um one of the things that really struck me when I was talking to people is I often would begin with the same question, which was, how did you get on the path that you're on and, making the music that you're making? And I tried to ask that in an open-ended way, not to sort of push people towards a particular way of thinking about how to respond to that question.
Mhm.
And, I found that there was a very clear kind of, difference that ran along the lines of race in terms of how people answered that question. And I found that and some of this is generational. So, I mean, I would say the white musicians that I've interviewed had generally been younger, like on the younger side of things. Um, but, like the response would be often from many white musicians was, that either that they had gotten their start in an institution somewhere, right? They, at a certain point in school, they began playing the trumpet or playing the drums or whatever whatever their instrument was. Or they might respond by saying, when I was 10, somebody gave me a Miles Davis record and I listened to it and it was just incredibly inspired. And I decided, to pick up the trumpet and began studying. And that's sort of another answer. But I'd say over 95% of Black respondents that I've talked to, asked that question, start with family. So I began thinking much more seriously about family as a repository of knowledge and one of the oral transmission systems that has existed. And so I make that argument in the book, that Black families were, before the rise of the recording industry, that Black families were the most impactful, social institution for the the maintenance and reproduction and evolution of music in the U.S. And so um, then I started to really think about how that may have functioned within families, and not to say, excuse me, that families were the only repository, not at all, but they are one of the ones that we can trace to a degree, right? And uh, when I think about families, I also think about the broader communities that surrounded them. So we can sort of chart out maybe certain lineages uh, of transmission of music, musicality. Sometimes physical instruments were being passed down. And it's amazing to me how many musicians I would talk to said, "Well, I began playing music. My uncle was a drummer. My grandmother was a piano player, and my aunt was a dancer and worked with Duke Ellington." I mean, I've heard these kinds of stories over and over and over again. I mean, similar stories like that, and when I was young, when John Coltrane was in Boston, he used to stop by our house because he knew my uncle, or things like that. And so it just got me thinking about family as a central piece, I think, of the way in which music has been passed down over time. So yeah, I think that was sort of a big um, jump for me, in thinking about how um, music has been maintained, how it has evolved, and how it's been passed down outside of the kind of formal institutional structures that often didn't include Black musicians and so forth. So yeah, I think that kind of led me to write the book that I wrote with I Hear Freedom, and then and it's continued in the current project that I'm working on, which looks much more broadly.
Do you wanna speak a little bit about your current project?
Sure. I mean, it's a project that has grown, and I kind of joke that if I had known how big it would get, I wouldn't have started it. I'm sort of crazy, but But it's been just incredibly fascinating. What I've done is, I mean, so with I Hear Freedom, I was focusing on this generation of 200 musicians, and then kind of ended up focusing on people that emerged out of Cleveland and Detroit. And actually, just to respond to your earlier question, you asked, I think, about kind of the limit of oral histories. I realized I didn't completely respond to that. And I should say the musicians that came out of Cleveland, almost none of them were still alive when I wrote the book. There were two primary interviewees. Detroit, there were more people I could interview. Um, so, but I interviewed musicians, I interviewed widows, I interviewed children of musicians, I interviewed friends, I interviewed people who'd worked with them in a professional sense, like a label or through a venue or different things like that. So, I tried to get as much as I could, but of course, that can only go so far in terms of chronology, going back into the history. So so yeah. My current research. So, I took what I was doing with this and I just decided to expand it out. And originally I was thinking, how did the free jazz generation differ from the bebop generation in terms of uh, migrations, in terms of origin points in various parts of the South? I mean, I had the question in my head, did they literally come from different places? I mean, would that somehow, maybe inform to a degree some of the work that they did? Yeah, obviously there are all the musical connections happening in the mid 20th century, early mid 20th century that also inform that. But I wanted to think about that. And so I began researching the bebop generation and I thought, well, maybe I should just go back to the beginnings of jazz. And so I researched every jazz musician of African descent in the U.S. born before 1950, looking at ancestral origins. And so I think that was about a little over 1,500 people, every significant one, I should say. And I tried, and by significant, I mean, I tried to really include everyone that I could find information about. And, you see the different phases of jazz. You definitely see, um, how say a city like Chicago, which was so heavily informed from people who are coming out of a blues culture in Mississippi versus, you know, say how Philadelphia arose as a musical city, or New York, or Detroit for that matter, or Los Angeles, and seeing different kind of origin points. And so I found that really interesting. So I began I did, tracing families is back on every branch of the family as far back as possible, and then cataloging, every migrational movement that was present in there. And so I have slightly over 16,000 migrational movements that I've cataloged through that process. And what comes out of it, well, I should say, I also then, after taking a year of sort of thinking about the project, I began thinking, well, I'm really not seeing the full picture, and so I wanted to include the blues as well. And so I included every blues musician of African descent born before 1920, and that's a slightly over 1,600 people. And then I began adding in other people who didn't fall into blues and jazz. So there's about 3,600 musicians included in the study. And once you get that volume of data, I mean, you think one migrational movement might not tell us anything because we don't know for sure always what is traveling along these routes. But when you look at 3,600 musicians and over 16,000 migrational movements, you start to see some pretty interesting patterns. Um, and you start to see certain parts of the country, um, where there are a lot of musician origin points that may not have yet, may not really be thought of necessarily as um, the genesis points of music. Um, So, I mean, the study, of course, has confirmed things that we already know. I mean, when we look at, say, New Orleans, it's so far off the charts compared to any other city in the country. I mean, it's kind of it's awe-inspiring in a way to see. Mississippi as well. I mean, 1 out of 6 blues musicians born before 1920 was born in the state of Mississippi. Um, and you could say those 2 examples are actually kind of almost opposite of each other. You have, sort of the urbanization that's happening in New Orleans, Creole communities, and all that kind of very clearly in the record. And Mississippi, it's such an incredible grassroots movement coming from all over rather than one center, right? And so, there's things like that that just come out of the data, and you know, and you start to see these trends. And then you start to see, I started to see other things in the data that I felt like were maybe slightly more surprising, perhaps. Not surprising that we didn't expect it, but that I just don't think that we've had the data really to look at it before. Um, certain concentrations of musician origin points. For example, West Alabama is just incredibly it's off the charts. Around Selma, uh, so many musicians have roots there. Um, and we don't see very many studies of West Alabama musical culture. Um, and, so that, I mean, things like that really have stood out. Granville County, North Carolina, has more origin points than any other place in the country outside of New Orleans. And Granville County, I mean, it's so far off the charts. As I was doing this research, I'd be researching families and see, another family with a root in Granville County. So, you know, I started to find things like that are just really interesting, and I'm not completely sure in every case what it is telling us, but it definitely shows, I think, patterns of oral transmission
Mhm.
of African musical ideas and concepts over time. I mean, it began as a Great Migration study, and I now feel like the new phase of research, what it tells us about the period before 1865, before the Civil War, is actually I think perhaps more revealing. Um, I mean, those origin points. North Carolina is another is it's a North Carolina, Louisiana, Mississippi are the three states with the largest number of musician origin points. Now, Louisiana makes sense, right? I mean, for in terms of New Orleans being this incredible center, urban center in a way that sort of predated most, the 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 kind of major, kind of urban musical movements that happened later. And then Mississippi, I think, just because of its like centrality to the emergence of blues, also makes sense. But I think North Carolina, to an extent, I think is a little bit of a perhaps something of a surprise. Um, and some of that is rooted in the small but I think very significant free black community that existed there going all the way back into the early 18th century. And so many of the North Carolina lineages come out of the free black community. And so that's something I've been working on and beginning to write about for my next project. Um, Beyond that, I mean, you can see movements all across the country. You can see the movements of people from, say, Virginia and the Carolinas across the Deep South, through Georgia, through Alabama to Mississippi, up to Texas. You see the mass movement of enslaved people from Virginia and Carolinas, via maritime routes to New Orleans and other parts of the Deep South, in the 1840s, 30s, 1830s and 40s. You'd see movements westward. I mean, almost all the musicians that emerged out of Missouri, I mean, the vast majority of them, there's just a clear line straight across the country where their ancestors had come from, Virginia to Kentucky to Missouri, and almost without variation. So there's things like that are really interesting. Also can see things like the Underground Railroad, very clearly illustrated in a lot of these oral transmission lines. I mentioned that in terms of Cleveland and Detroit and Ohio having so many Underground Railroad connections in the musical lineages. And Ohio is off the charts with that, but you see it from uh, you know Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, all the way through Ohio to Indiana and Illinois. Various links to the Underground Railroad. And there are musicians that I've worked with personally. The pianist Dave Burrell, for example, who was born in Southern Ohio in 1940, and he was based in New York for a long time, and I think he was in Paris for a time, and now he lives in Philadelphia. But um, you know, his family on numerous branches had connections to the Underground Railroad. In fact, his great-great-great-great-grandmother, um, founded a major settlement. It was a Black farming community in Southern Ohio that became a major route on the Underground Railroad. So, there's just things like that that come out that are so, that I think connect the history of this music to all these other kind of, historical events and movements where whereas I think sometimes music, studies gets a little bit disconnected from the world around it to a degree. If it's just sort of we're looking for how one part, one bit of music influenced another bit of music. So I've been trying to kind of bring music studies kind of into these broader conversations, I think, a bit with this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Um, for and yeah. I mean, to have a critical mass of origin points in a particular free community in North Carolina is something that's not as much talked about. I mean, I know that there is more conversation now about the blues since Sinners came out, more broadly speaking, but
Right.
and it makes sense that there would be Mississippi points, but even maybe the volume of it had not necessarily been cataloged before in this way.
Yeah, I mean, not that I'm, necessarily focused on quantifying things, but, you know, seeing all the data and being able to quantify it in certain ways has definitely changed how I think about American music to a degree, to a degree, and thinking about, how all of these things developed. I mean, again, I'm in Mississippi. I remember at some point I just kind of stopped and looked at it and thought, it's really profound to see all over the state, musicians coming out of rural communities and small towns and people kind of maybe gradually moving over to the Delta to be involved in the music. But it's you wonder. I mean, it definitely opens up a lot of questions. I think about how that process happened.
Yeah. So I wanted to I do have a question that
Mhm.
not one of the ones I sent you,
Please,
but I am interested to know a little bit more about your documentary film. Um,
yeah. Take me to Fendica.
yeah.
So I went to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 2018, and I was working with a student of mine, and he and I we went there to shoot a documentary, and we wanted to, we wanted to work with Malaku Balai, who's just an extraordinary uh, dancer who has taken, I think, over 80 different traditional forms of Ethiopian dance, and then he's an improviser, so and he works. I mean, to a degree, he works in the jazz idiom, and he'll weave all of this sort of incredibly broad and rich dance vocabulary into his performances, and he also runs an art space there, and so we went and met with him and basically collaborated with him to put together the documentary, and yeah, we it took how long did it took 6 years, I think, to finish the film. It's the first film I've worked on as a director, and so yeah, I mean, I think in a way I was trying to do what I do with oral, maybe with sort of kind of the oral history collecting, and uh, tried to work with him to and some of the other, some of the musicians there to kind of tell that story. Um, and it's all told through the musicians' voices. We don't have any academic talking heads or anything like that. So yeah, it was eye opening because I was learning how to direct and produce a film. So and I was fortunate to have. I mean, the student I was working with shot the film, so he brought those skills to it, and then I ended up working with a couple of really great collaborators, Brianna Monet, who ended up being the editor. She's based in Los Angeles, and um, I mean, I think I hired her for 2 months, and she ended up working with me for initially, I hired her for 2 months, and we ended up working together for 2 years or something, and she just brought such an amazing eye to it. And then the producer is an Ethiopian American woman named Solem Daniel, and so I felt like we tried to make it as there isn't a I mean there's a I think a budding film industry in Ethiopia. We tried to work with as many people from Ethiopia as we could to kind of keep it grounded in the culture there, and thinking about how people thinking through how people would want to be portrayed and all of that. And so um yeah, I mean it was a long process, but it made me realize that there are other ways to tell stories beyond writing, right? And so with the migration research that I'm doing now and looking at these, the oral transmission process, I've been I've been, I'm the student that worked with me on that first film, he and I are creating a small independent production company, and we're thinking about, putting together a film, maybe a documentary film series on it. So I don't know, it's opened my eyes a bit because, I don't have formal training in film, so it's definitely been a learning process. But, yeah, it's been a really exciting, process. And I should say, Take Me to Fendica, I mean, it got way more reception than I ever expected. I mean, just because I didn't have a background in film, hadn't really been involved with the making of film before, and we were able to screen it at a number of festivals in the U.S. and in Africa, in a number of places, several film festivals there. We did a big premiere in Ethiopia, it was screened in Angola and Equatorial Guinea. And then, we some festivals in Canada and Europe. So yeah, it was really, really a wonderful experience.
Thank you. So, how is your you've talked quite a bit about how you approach your research and the work that you're doing on the transmission of African music in the Great Migration. How do you feel that Black Studies informs your work as a teacher?
Yeah, well, I do teach a range of courses. I teach courses on social movements. I teach courses on social movements, both domestically and internationally. I teach classes on jazz history, but in a very, I think, a fairly unique way, in that I'm not a musicologist. I don't come at it from that perspective. I you know, I, uh, I really generally frame a lot of um, the music-oriented courses that I teach as a historian, around issues of uh, migration, the Great Migration. I just started a new course that I think it's called "The Great Migration and the Emergence of American Music," looking at different sites around the country. I think the course is told through, I think it's 10 cities. So, we have a couple weeks on, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, and so forth. Um, and so I guess I think about music often as a social process, that kind of comes through the migration of people, the formation of communities, especially in urban sites, where culture often become the culture the process of cultural production becomes very dynamic. Um, think about community formation as an assemblage of people from maybe a wide range of places. Think of New York City. I mean, there's musicians here now from all over the world, right? But even 100 years ago, you had people from, a pretty broad range of places. So I think thinking about music kind of a social process, I think is pretty central to how I teach, and that has to be informed by Black studies if we're going to talk about American music. I mean, I also frame any discussion of music within the social, cultural, and political history of the time in which it was made. I think I don't know. I mean, this is it's probably an old critique of musicology, but sometimes I think music studies can be a little bit disconnected from the society that's producing it. And so I always try to get that really rooted. And I have a class that I teach on free jazz that really looks at that '60s 1960s, 70s kind of generation, and then it does come up to the present. But I do try to look at the roots of it, which are really set within the civil rights movement and the Black Power movements. So, so yeah, I mean, I think that all has to be, I think, pretty directly informed, from a wide range of scholars and disciplines that are present within Black studies.
Thank you.
Sure.
So, two more questions, and then I can give you back the rest of your day. Um, so, and you might feel like you've kind of covered this a little bit, but what interests you most about the past of Black studies?
Past, I think, I think black, I think Black studies is so. I mean, it's an intellectual field of inquiry. It's also, I think, intimately tied to what is the United States.
Mm,
I mean, think about how, um, you know, we could think about this even in, I mean, our current political moment or in other political moments. That I think, I guess I always feel like Black studies is on the vanguard of where this country is at. And so I think, I always look to Black studies as a temperature gauge of what is going on. And I think we can see that, over time, um, you know, if we look back through the past. I also think there's this thing of, this sort of connection to action, the call to action. I mean, it's a field of inquiry, of course, but I think because of, um, how, Black studies has developed, in the US, I think it naturally is also a call to action. And so I find that, I think, really vital and really, I think, inspiring. And thinking about, how Black studies has been, among many other things, a critique of the power structures of the United States, the racial dynamics, obviously, um, and thinking about, all of that. And so, to me, um, I think, it has from its inception been, I think a real, been situated there on the forefront of trying to understand, every aspect of the United States in a way.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, what interests or excites you most about the future?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think maybe to state the obvious, we're in a difficult political moment right now. So, to say the least. So, I think given all of the impositions that have been placed on Black studies just in recent years, whether it's, uh, attempts at controlling public school curriculums in certain states, or whether it's, um, pressure being applied to universities that offer Black studies programs to manipulate them in certain ways, or whether it's, uh, the mass cuts to federal grants that, um, that would normally be supporting Black studies. So there's all of that stuff going on. I mean, I'm sure people listening to the podcast can relate. I mean, I was recently thinking of applying to a federal grant program, and of course, quickly learned that, uh, in the application, uh, I'm not supposed to use the word race, not supposed to use the word slavery, I'm not supposed to use the word black or white. I'm supposed to pretend that race doesn't exist. I mean, we've reached such an absurdity. I don't even know where to, I mean, any thinking person can see the problems with it. So I don't know really know what to say about all that. But it's, I think, we're at I think a critical point, and I think, there's a lot of work to do. I think coming up, and figuring out how we can push back, how we can, um, how we can support, kind of mutual efforts, how we can build solidarity, how we can collaborate. Um, I think are all important things, and I think I would like to, I guess have a dose of optimism that I think we can get things to a better place, but there is a lot going on, it's not necessarily clear to me, where things are going to go, and so, yeah, I mean, that's just to say, I guess, that there's a lot of work coming. Hopefully, some positive changes in the near term, but I don't think anything is guaranteed, and so I think we all need to work together and what we can do, and I want to contribute in the ways that I can to support that effort.
Well, thank you so
Mm.
much. Is there anything you'd like to add before I give you back the rest of your day?
Well, I hope people will check out I Hear Freedom, and I realized I didn't talk about too much about the musicians themselves, actually, and much of the book is about the individual careers of musicians
Yeah.
that emerged out of Cleveland and Detroit. Sometimes I get so into kind of talking about the frame of the book that that I don't talk about that enough. I mean, uh, a lot of really magnificent musicians, brilliant, genius musicians from that era, who I think were really thinking outside of the box and really, really, I mean, just had really, I think, incredible imaginations. I mean, to think about it, and we're taking. I mean, somebody like Albert Ayler, who's probably the most well-known musician included in the book. I mean, he was reformulating, I think aspects of everything from gospel to blues to jazz to other, many other things. And, I think it just, that era, the 60s and the 70s, I mean, I think we're still fascinated with it now because it was an era of such incredible art and music. And so it was, I felt very fortunate to write this about these artists. And there are many other people in the book who are maybe lesser known, but I think also incredible, made incredible contributions to the music, like saxophonist Charles Tyler, saxophonist Frank Wright, lots of saxophonist Farouk Bey from Detroit, and many others. It's I think it shows. I think that era and some of these musicians in particular, I mean, really show the possibilities of what might be kind of defined as avant-garde, which was thinking out, really just thinking past the limits of the moment, right? And thinking past the limits of what had already been done and really tried to delve into something new. And um, while simultaneously, many of them were involved in directly or indirectly in the Black freedom movements of the time. I didn't start the book thinking I was going to be interviewing people about the Black Power movement, but that just came organically out of conversations. Almost everybody that I talked to brought it up, and so it made me really, I kind of went in with this idea or thinking, you know, was freedom in music connected to freedom more broadly? And I came away thinking that, with what everyone, with all what so many people said to me is that there was an obvious, very clear connection. And so, yeah, I mean, I hope people will check out the book. And I think, um, definitely trying to kind of, I think, come up with new ways of thinking about free jazz, as an art form and getting beyond I think some of the more stale narratives that have kind of confined it, I think, the way that we think about it for a long time. So anyway, yeah. It's really an honor to be on this podcast, and I love the series, and I really appreciate you having me on and asking such intriguing and interesting questions.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Um, and I really like the book. being from Michigan, having that focus on Detroit was really
Yeah.
fascinating to me. Um,
Yeah, well, both of those cities have not been written about enough, I think.
yeah,
And Detroit in particular is just it's a major American music city. I mean, just
yeah,
it somehow gets left out sometimes when people are talking about New York, Chicago, LA. But Detroit, I mean, it's invented several forms of music by itself, you know? So
yeah. It has, and
so
then, like, the influence that the music made there has had other places, in multiple genres, has just been underappreciated for sure.
for sure. Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll never forget one of the first times I went to Detroit. I was talking with one of the local musicians, and he said, "For you to understand, you know, he's a jazz saxophone player." He said, "For you to understand the city, you need to listen to techno." So he immediately took me to a record
Yep.
store. And these are the bands you should be listening to, you know, and it made me realize, you know, that these things are all interconnected. And yeah, yeah, Detroit's a special place. I every time I go there, I learn something new about the city, and you know, like I've seen so many incredible concerts there and stuff. So there's a real living musical culture there today.
Yeah, yeah, there is. Well, thank you so, so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yes, you too. So thank you so much. Take care.
Yep, bye.